The soldier had no name in the record. He was listed only as a member of the 3rd cohort, stationed at the southern edge of Roman Egypt, at a garrison so far from Rome that the men there had stopped counting the days. He had survived the civil wars. He had marched through the deserts of Arabia. He had stood in formation while Augustus Caesar himself rode past on a white horse, and the crowd roared like thunder. He believed, as every Roman soldier believed, that the empire was unbreakable, that the eagle standards planted in the earth made that earth Roman forever, that the world beyond the borders was not a world at all, just chaos waiting to be organized. He never saw them coming. The arrows arrived before the sound did, before the alarm bells, before the dogs started barking, before the sentries on the wall had time to draw a single breath of warning. And when the sun finally rose over the garrison at Syene that morning, it rose over ruins, overturned grain carts, shattered Roman standards, and the unmistakable absence of every statue, every bronze image, every carved face of Augustus Caesar that had been placed there to remind the people of the Nile who ruled them. They were gone, all of them, dragged south into the desert, into a kingdom Rome barely understood and dangerously underestimated. The woman who ordered it had one eye, and she had just made the most powerful man on earth very, very angry. To understand what she did, you have to understand what Rome was in those years. Not the Rome of textbooks and marble columns, but the Rome of fear and hunger and exhausted ambition. The Rome of a world that had been at war with itself for decades and was only now, barely, learning to breathe again. Because the Roman Republic, that 500-year experiment in collective governance, in consuls and senators, and the idea that no single man should hold absolute power, was dead. It had not died cleanly. It had been strangled slowly over generations by men who were too ambitious and a system too brittle to contain them. Julius Caesar had been the breaking point. He had crossed the Rubicon with his army, marched on Rome itself, seized power, and then made the fatal mistake of letting people see exactly what he was. A king in everything but name. And Rome, which prided itself on having expelled its last king 5 centuries before, could not tolerate that. So, on the 15th of March, in a year the Romans called 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators surrounded him on the floor of the Senate chamber and drove their knives into his body 23 times. They believed they were saving the Republic. They were ending it. Because Caesar's death did not restore the old order. It detonated another civil war. Years of blood. Rival generals carving the Mediterranean into competing fiefdoms. Cities burning. Fleets sinking. Whole legions annihilated in single afternoons. And when the last smoke cleared, only one man was left standing. His birth name was Gaius Octavius. He had been Caesar's adopted son, a thin, sickly young man whom almost everyone underestimated. He had outmaneuvered them all. He had defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. He had watched Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, the last heir of a dynasty that had ruled the Nile for 3 centuries, take her own life rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome as a war trophy. He had taken Egypt for himself and then renamed himself Augustus, the revered one, and he had done something Julius Caesar never managed. He had hidden what he was. Augustus never called himself king. He called himself princeps, the first citizen. He let the Senate keep its marble halls and its ceremonial authority. He let the old families keep their titles. He gave Rome the performance of a republic restored, while quietly, methodically, constructing something the world had never quite seen before. A permanent military autocracy wrapped in the language of tradition. He controlled the armies. He controlled the food supply. He controlled who lived and who was quietly removed. The Senate still voted. But Augustus had already decided. He was not yet 40 years old, and he had already redrawn the map of the known world. Egypt was his crown jewel, not a province handed to the Senate like Gaul or Hispania. Egypt was his personal possession, administered by a prefect who answered only to him, never to Rome's legislative body. And the reason was simple. Egypt fed Rome, literally. A third of the grain that kept the Roman population alive came from Egyptian fields, loaded onto ships in Alexandria, and sailed across the Mediterranean. Without Egypt, Rome starved. With Egypt, Augustus controlled the stomach of the empire, and through the stomach, its loyalty. Egypt's gold funded the legions. Its position at the mouth of the Nile controlled access to the interior of Africa and the trade routes of the Red Sea. To hold Egypt was to hold the beating heart of an empire. But hearts require borders, and borders require knowing what lies beyond them. South of Egypt, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, that churning wall of white water and black rock near the city of Syene, lay a land that Rome had heard of in fragments. In travelers' tales and merchants' rumors, in the reports of Greek geographers who wrote about it from a comfortable distance without ever actually going there. The Romans called it Ethiopia, a Greek word meaning the land of the burnt-faced people. The Egyptians had called it Tarseti, the land of the bow, a reference to the archers who had terrorized Pharaoh's armies for centuries. Its people called it Kush, and it was nothing like what Rome imagined. Kush was not a backwater. It was not a collection of wandering tribes scratching out an existence in the desert. It was an empire. One of the oldest in the world, with a history stretching back over 1,000 years before Rome had even thought to cross its first river. At its height, Kush had done something no other kingdom in the ancient world had managed. It had conquered Egypt, the 25th dynasty of pharaohs. The Black Pharaohs, as modern scholars call them, were Kushite kings who had marched north and ruled the Nile from the mountains of Nubia all the way to the Mediterranean coast. They had restored temples that had fallen into ruin. They had defeated the Assyrians when Assyria was the most terrifying military force on earth. They had left their names carved in hieroglyphs across monuments from Thebes to Memphis, standing equal to any pharaoh who had ever lived. That was centuries before Rome arrived. Since then, Kush had shifted south, not in defeat but in deliberate retreat, pulling its center of power deeper into Nubia, beyond the reach of the Mediterranean powers that rose and fell and rose again like desert storms. The Persians had taken Egypt. Alexander the Great had taken Egypt. The Greeks had taken Egypt. And through all of it, Kush had watched from the south, adapted, endured, and remained itself. Their capital, by the time Rome came knocking, was Meroe, a city deep in the Nubian desert that most Romans could not have found on a map. But Meroe was extraordinary. Its iron smelters produced metal on a scale that had no parallel anywhere in Africa. Iron-tipped weapons, iron tools, iron goods that flowed through trade networks reaching east to India and south into the African interior. Its gold mines generated wealth that made merchants from Egypt and Arabia travel weeks through desert heat just to sit in its markets. Ivory, ebony, exotic animals, lions and elephants and giraffes destined for Roman arenas, all passed through Kushite hands, taxed and traded and moved along routes that Kushite merchants had been managing for generations. Meroe was a crossroads, a hub, a city where you could hear a dozen languages in a single afternoon and watch gold change hands between people whose homelands were a month's journey apart in opposite directions. And at the center of it all, making decisions about taxes and treaties and war and peace, were the rulers of Kush. And here is where the story becomes something Rome was entirely unprepared for. The rulers of Kush were women, not always, not exclusively, but with a regularity and an institutional weight that had no parallel in the Mediterranean world. The title was Kandake. The Greeks and Romans, whose languages bent every foreign word into something they could pronounce, called it Candace. It meant Queen Mother. But in practice, in the full political and military reality of Kushite governance, it meant sovereign. It meant commander. It meant the person whose word was final on matters of war and agriculture and justice and diplomacy. Kandake appeared on temple walls with the same iconography as male pharaohs, standing over defeated enemies, weapons raised, crowns balanced on their heads. They were buried in pyramids with the full honors of royalty. They negotiated with foreign powers. They led armies into battle. This was not exceptional in Kush. This was normal. This was simply how power worked. To Rome it was baffling. Rome had powerful women. Augustus's own wife Livia wielded influence that shaped the empire behind carefully closed doors. But openly, on a throne, issuing commands to generals, that was not how Rome understood the world to function. And that misunderstanding, that fundamental failure to take the Kandake seriously as a military and political force, was one of the most expensive mistakes the empire ever made. In the year 27 before the Common Era, a woman named Amanirenas came to power in Kush. We do not know exactly when she was born. The Kushites had their own writing system, Meroitic script, and we can read fragments of it, enough to recognize names and titles, but not enough to reconstruct the full interior life of the kingdom. What we know comes filtered through Egyptian records, through Greek geographers who wrote about Kush, the way people write about places they've never been, through Roman historians who mentioned it only when Rome was directly involved, and through the ground itself, through the pyramids and temple walls and buried objects that archaeologists have spent the last century pulling from the Nubian sand. What the evidence tells us is this: Amanirenas was experienced. She was not a young queen finding her footing. She had fought battles, she had governed, and at some point in her life, in circumstances history has chosen not to record, she lost an eye. The images that survive of her show a broad, powerful figure, not the idealized, slender beauty of Greek sculpture, not the serene femininity of Roman portraiture. Amanirenas in stone is built like someone who has carried weight her entire life. Wide shoulders, a commanding presence, one eye that misses nothing. She ruled alongside her son, Prince Kandake, a military commander who led forces in the field while his mother directed strategy from Meroe. Together they watched Rome settle into Egypt with the cold efficiency of an empire that had done this before. Augustus installed his prefect. Roman tax collectors spread south. Roman soldiers fortified positions along the Nile. Roman administrators looked at the buffer zone between Roman Egypt and independent Kush, a strip of contested territory called the Dodecastiones, the 12-mile land, and began treating it as their own. And Amanirenas watched, and calculated, and waited. She had read history, even if history had not read her. She knew what Rome had done to Carthage. She knew what Rome had done to Corinth and Jerusalem, and every kingdom that had stood in the open and challenged the legions directly. She did not intend to make that mistake. She was not going to march her army north in a straight line and dare Rome to meet her on a battlefield Rome had chosen. She was going to be smarter than that. She was going to make the empire pay for every inch it claimed. She just needed the right moment. And in 27, before the Common Era, Rome handed it to her. Augustus was in Spain when the news arrived. He was bogged down in the mountains of Cantabria, fighting the kind of war that empires hate most. Not a glorious conquest with a clean ending, but a grinding, miserable campaign against mountain tribes who refused to accept that they had lost. The Cantabrians did not fight like a proper enemy. They did not line up on a field and let Roman discipline grind them into dust. They vanished into ravines. They poisoned wells. They struck at night and were gone by morning. Augustus had been at it for months, and the victories, when they came, felt hollow. A village burned here, a hill fort taken there. Nothing that felt like an ending. The rest of Rome's military attention was fixed on the northern frontiers. The Rhine, the Danube, the restless Germanic tribes that pressed against the empire's edges like water against a dam. Egypt, by contrast, was considered solved, secure, a province so thoroughly pacified that its garrison could be thinned, its prefect reassigned to other ambitions. The man currently in charge of Egypt, a prefect named Aulus Gallus, had been ordered to prepare an expedition eastward into Arabia, toward the spice routes and the wealth of the Red Sea. Rome's eyes were pointed in every direction except south, which was precisely when Amanirenas moved. Kushite forces crossed the border before dawn, not a raiding party, not a patrol in force. An army organized, disciplined, and moving with a speed that suggested the routes had been scouted long in advance, the timing calculated down to the season, the hour, the position of Roman reinforcements. They hit Syene first, the garrison town at the edge of Roman-controlled territory. The soldiers stationed there were not expecting war. They were expecting another quiet morning at the edge of the known world, another day of watching the Nile move south and wishing they were somewhere else. The archers came first, Kushite bowmen, the descendants of warriors the ancient Egyptians had feared enough to name an entire region after, took their positions on the high ground before the garrison had finished its first watch rotation. When they released their first volley, the arrows fell so thick that soldiers later described the sound as rain. Not the gentle rain of the Mediterranean coast, but the hard, percussive rain of a desert storm, sudden and absolute, and leaving nothing standing. The infantry followed through the gaps. Kushite warriors moved through the streets of Syene with the focused efficiency of people who had planned this down to the last doorway. They were not there to massacre. They were there to take prisoners. Roman soldiers, Egyptian auxiliaries, officials of the empire were bound and marched south. Grain stores were emptied, weapons were seized, and then the Kushite force turned its attention to the things that mattered most, the things that would send a message louder than any battle cry. The statues. Rome had placed them everywhere in the conquered south. Bronze images of Augustus Caesar, full-body sculptures, portrait heads, idealized representations of the emperor's face, frozen in an expression of serene, eternal authority, positioned in temples, in public squares, at garrison gates, in every place where the people of the Nile would have to look at them and remember who ruled this land now. They were not just decoration, they were propaganda in bronze and stone, a permanent silent announcement that Augustus was divine, that Rome was forever, that resistance was not merely futile but somehow cosmically inappropriate. Amanirenas had them pulled down, everyone within reach. Her soldiers worked with ropes and levers, toppling the heavy statues from their pedestals, letting them crash onto the stones. Some were smashed, some were left where they fell, but a selection of the finest, the most detailed, the most obviously imperial, the bronze heads of the emperor himself were loaded onto carts and carried south. Hundreds of miles, through desert heat that could kill an unprotected man in an afternoon, over sand and rock and the brutal indifference of the Nubian landscape. Try to hold that image for a moment. A column of Kushite warriors moving through the desert, pulling carts loaded with the bronze faces of the most powerful man alive, the sheer stubbornness of it, the organizational will it required. They were not doing this for practical reasons. Bronze is heavy, the journey was punishing, and they were moving away from enemy territory, not toward it. They were doing it because they understood something Rome did not yet understand about this war, that this was not just a military conflict. It was an argument about power itself, about who was allowed to be permanent, about whose image belonged in the temples of the Nile. When they reached Meroe, Amanirenas made her final statement. One of the bronze heads, the finest of them, a portrait of Augustus that captured every detail of his face with the technical mastery of Roman craftsmanship at its height, was taken to the steps of a temple, not displayed, not mounted on a wall as a trophy, buried, placed face up in the earth beneath the threshold, so that every person who entered the temple for generations to come, every priest, every noble, every ordinary citizen of Kush bringing an offering to the gods, would walk across the face of Rome's emperor without even knowing it. It was the most elegant act of contempt in the ancient world. When the reports reached Augustus in Spain, the silence in the room must have been extraordinary. A southern kingdom, a kingdom that most Romans would have struggled to locate precisely on a map, had crossed into Roman territory, destroyed a garrison, seized prisoners, looted towns, torn down the emperor's image, and dragged it into the desert as a war prize. The military damage was real but manageable. The political damage was something else entirely. Rome's entire system of power rested on a single foundational belief, that defiance was futile, that the empire always responded, that the eagle standards once planted were never removed. If that belief cracked, if other kingdoms and tribes and pliant states along Rome's vast frontiers began to suspect that defiance was possible, the consequences could cascade in every direction at once. Augustus could not ignore this. He could not minimize it. He needed a response that was overwhelming, immediate and visible. He gave the task to the new prefect of Egypt, a man named Gaius Petronius. And Petronius, to his credit, did not underestimate what he was walking into. He was a soldier of the old school, pragmatic, methodical, the kind of commander who checked his supply lines 3 times before he checked his swords. He had served long enough to know that the desert was its own enemy, and that armies which forgot that fact left their bones in the sand. He assembled his forces carefully. 3 Roman legions, somewhere between 15,000 and 18,000 soldiers in heavy formation, supplemented by auxiliary cavalry and local allies who knew the terrain. He gathered supplies, he established forward depots. He planned for a campaign that would go deep and hit hard and make the Kushites understand the cost of the morning at Syene. In 25 before the Common Era, Petronius marched south. The crossing of the first cataract was the first test. The Nile at Syene broke into white water and jagged rock, impassable by boat, barely passable by land. Roman engineers built temporary bridges, hauled equipment over the rocks on improvised sledges, forced the army through a landscape designed by geography to slow invaders. It took days. It cost men to injury and heat. But Petronius got his legions across. What followed was a Roman campaign executed with the full weight of the empire's military tradition. Petronius did not chase the Kushites through the desert. He advanced on their cities, their fixed points, their places of meaning. He retook Syene. He pushed south to Selchis, a fortified Kushite position, and offered its defenders a chance to surrender. They refused. He took it by assault. He continued south through heat that the Roman soldiers had no cultural vocabulary for, temperatures that turned armor into an oven, that cracked lips and burned eyes and made every mile feel like 3. Men fell to heat stroke. Diseases moved through the ranks. The supply lines behind them stretched thinner with every step. Petronius was relentless because he understood that this campaign had one purpose above all others. It had to reach somewhere that mattered. It had to strike something Kush cared about deeply enough that the message would be unmistakable. And so he drove his army south until they reached Napata. Napata was not the current capital of Kush. The court had moved to Meroe generations before. But Napata was sacred in a way that went beyond politics. It was the ancient heart of the kingdom, the city where the black pharaohs had been crowned, where the first great Kushite kings had built their pyramids, where the temples had stood for centuries as physical evidence that this civilization had been great before Rome was a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. Its pyramids rose from the desert floor like pointed fingers aimed at the sky. Its temples housed gods whose worship stretched back 1,000 years. Petronius sacked it. Roman soldiers moved through Napata with systematic thoroughness. Gold was stripped from temple walls, statues were toppled, buildings burned. Prisoners, thousands of them, were bound and organized into columns that would march north to Egypt and eventually to the slave markets of the Mediterranean. It was the same message Rome had sent to Carthage, to Corinth, to every city that had made the mistake of becoming a symbol of resistance. We can reach you. We can take the things you love. We can reduce your history to ash and rubble and teach your children to carry water for Roman households. It was brutal. It was effective. And it did not end the war. Because Amanirenas was not in Napata, she had never intended to be. She understood with a military clarity that Petronius had not fully anticipated, that fighting Rome on Rome's terms was suicide. You did not stand in the open against Roman legions. You did not defend fixed positions against Roman siege engineers. You did not let Roman discipline and Roman numbers grind your forces into dust on a flat field. You made them pay for the terrain. You made them chase shadows. You made the desert itself the weapon. While Petronius was marching his legions south toward Napata, a march that took weeks, that consumed enormous quantities of food and water, that left soldiers exhausted and supply lines dangerously extended, Kushite forces were already repositioning, moving through wadis, dry riverbeds that cut like hidden corridors through the rock and sand, following routes that Roman scouts had not mapped and could not map without years of experience in this specific landscape, appearing where they were not expected and vanishing before a response could be organized. The guerrilla campaign that followed the fall of Napata was, in many ways, more damaging to Rome than the initial raid had been. Kushite archers targeted supply caravans moving north along the Nile Road. A column of grain carts with a modest escort could be destroyed in minutes by archers firing from a ridgeline and be gone before reinforcements arrived. Roman patrols that ventured into the desert interior sometimes did not come back. Soldiers stationed at isolated outposts lived in a permanent state of low-grade terror, never certain whether the night would be quiet or whether arrows would come through the darkness. Petronius had won the Battle of Napata. He pulled his forces back to a fortified position at Primis, just south of the Dodecastionos, left a garrison to hold it, and returned north with his prisoners and his plunder. Rome declared victory. Official dispatches praised Petronius. The honor of Augustus was deemed restored, but Amanirenas had not surrendered. She had not negotiated. She had not sent envoys to beg for terms. She had simply changed the nature of the war, and now she tightened the knot. In 24 before the Common Era, Kushite forces surrounded Primis. Not a raid this time, a siege. A slow, deliberate, suffocating investment of the Roman garrison that Petronius had left behind as a statement of imperial permanence. The message Kush sent with that siege was elegant in its simplicity. You want to stay in our territory? Then stay, until your food runs out. Stay until your water becomes precious. Stay until your soldiers start counting days and the days stop meaning anything. The desert has patience that no empire can match. Petronius marched south again. He broke the siege. He drove the Kushites back. He resupplied the garrison and reorganized his forces, and then he sat down and began to do the mathematics that Amanirenas had been waiting for him to do. Every campaign south cost money, soldiers' pay, equipment, replacement, food and water transported over distances that made the logistics of the operation nearly as lethal as the enemy. The Dodecastionos, this strip of contested territory that Rome was bleeding to hold, generated no grain, no gold, no tax revenue worth the name. Egypt was secure, the grain was flowing, the Mediterranean was controlled. So what precisely was Rome gaining from this war? The answer, when Petronius stared at it honestly, was nothing, nothing except pride, nothing except the refusal to admit that an African queen had forced the empire to reconsider its southern border. And pride, however important to Rome's self-image, was not a line item that could be entered into a ledger against the cost of dead soldiers and exhausted supply chains. Slowly, reluctantly, Rome began to arrive at a conclusion that Amanirenas had been engineering from the beginning. This war was not worth winning. There is a particular kind of intelligence that empires rarely recognize until it is too late, the intelligence of someone who understands that they do not need to win. They only need to make winning too expensive for the other side. Amanirenas had never expected to conquer Rome. She had never marched her armies toward Alexandria with visions of planting Kushite standards on the Mediterranean coast. She was not fighting a war of expansion. She was fighting a war of exhaustion. And there is a profound difference between the two. A war of expansion requires you to be stronger than your enemy. A war of exhaustion only requires you to be more patient, to understand the terrain better, to know which costs your enemy will absorb and which costs will make him stop and recalculate. To fight not until you win, but until the other side decides that winning is no longer worth the price. She had studied Rome the way a general studies a battlefield. She knew its strengths, the legions, the engineering, the supply systems, the sheer organizational weight of an empire that could move resources across thousands of miles with frightening efficiency. She knew its weaknesses, the distance from the center of power, the dependence on supply lines that became fragile the moment they extended deep into hostile territory, the political pressure on every commander to produce visible, recordable victories rather than the slow, grinding work of occupation. She knew that Rome needed its wars to look like Rome. Formations, sieges, decisive battles, triumphant marches, plunder loaded onto ships, prisoners displayed in processions through the capital. She had given Rome none of that, and the absence was killing it. When Kushite envoys arrived at the court of Augustus on the island of Samos in the Aegean Sea, the emperor could have treated it as an insult. A foreign queen sending messengers to the heart of Roman power as though she were an equal, as though Kush and Rome were simply two neighbors settling a boundary dispute over a shared fence rather than the greatest empire on earth and a desert kingdom at the edge of the known world. By every convention of Roman diplomacy, Augustus should have received the envoys with cold condescension, extracted symbolic concessions, declared victory, and sent them home with a treaty that Rome would frame as an act of imperial generosity. He did not do that, and the reason he did not do that tells you everything about what Amanirenas had accomplished. The envoys carried no offer of surrender. They carried no tribute, no hostages, no acknowledgement that Rome had won. What they carried was a proposition, delivered with the calm confidence of people who had watched Rome's legions march into Nubia and then watched them struggle to leave. The proposition was this: Kush wanted peace, real peace, not the Roman kind, where peace meant submission and annual tribute and the quiet humiliation of a people who had once been free. Kush wanted a border, a clear, mutually recognized line that both sides would respect. Rome would withdraw its forces from the Dodecashokinos. Kushite raids into Roman Egypt would cease. Trade between the two kingdoms would continue, and neither side would owe the other anything. No tribute, no hostages, no formal acknowledgement that one power was lesser than the other. To the Roman mind, this was extraordinary. Rome did not make treaties with equals. Rome made treaties with the defeated. It accepted surrender and formalized the conditions of subjugation in language that left no room for misunderstanding about who had won and who had lost. The very architecture of Roman diplomacy was built on hierarchy, on the assumption that negotiation was simply the final formality after the real argument. The military argument had been settled, but Augustus was not, at his core, an idealist. He was a survivor. He had survived the assassination of his adoptive father. He had survived a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands. He had survived rivals who were older, more experienced, more beloved by the armies than he was. He had survived by being willing to accept reality as it was, rather than as he wished it to be. And the reality, as his prefect Petronius had made painfully clear, was that Nubia was not Egypt. It could not be administered the same way. It could not be held the same way. It was too remote, too hostile, too expensive, and its people had proven, with considerable emphasis, that they were not going to stop. Augustus sat with the Kushite envoys on Samos, and he listened, and then he agreed. The treaty that followed, what historians would come to call the Treaty of Samos, signed in the year 21 before the Common Era, was unlike almost anything else in the record of Roman foreign policy. Rome withdrew its forces from the Dodecashokinos entirely. The buffer zone returned to Kushite influence. Roman tax collectors left. Roman soldiers left. The border was established at the First Cataract and recognized by both sides. And Kush paid nothing. Not one grain of wheat, not one piece of gold. Not one hostage sent to Rome as a guarantee of future good behavior. Rome, the empire that had turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, that had burned Carthage to ash and plowed the earth with salt, that had crucified thousands of rebellious slaves along the Appian Way. As a warning to anyone who might be considering a similar gesture, Rome had negotiated a peace treaty with a one-eyed African queen and walked away with nothing except the stability of a border. It had decided it no longer needed to push. The official Roman version of events predictably described this as a strategic success. Augustus had secured Egypt's southern border. He had pacified the region. He had established lasting peace. This was the language of empire, the ability to describe a retreat as a destination. But anyone with access to the actual terms of the treaty, anyone who sat down and read what Rome had agreed to and what it had received in return, understood what had actually happened. Amanirenas had forced the most powerful man on earth to renegotiate the southern boundary of his empire on her terms. This is where Mementos historians believes history owes its largest debts, not to the victors who wrote it down, but to the people who lived it without being allowed to write anything at all. For Kush, the treaty was not just a diplomatic achievement. It was proof of something that would sustain the kingdom through 3 more centuries of independence. Proof that Rome was not the inevitable horizon, that empire was not destiny, that a people who knew their land, who understood their own strength, who were willing to absorb punishment and keep moving, could not be permanently broken by a force that was simply larger. Size was not the same as permanence. Power was not the same as endurance. And Amanirenas understood endurance in a way that no Roman general could. She had lost an eye. She had watched her kingdom threatened by the greatest military machine the Western world had ever assembled. She had sent her son into battle and spent years watching reports come back across the desert, never knowing with certainty whether the next messenger would bring news of victory or news that required her to prepare a tomb. She had sat in Mero through the brutal heat of campaigns that lasted years and kept calculating, kept planning, kept fighting in the only way that offered any chance of survival. She had not flinched, and the empire had. Now the border was quiet. Trade resumed along the Nile, Kushite merchants moving north with ivory and gold and exotic goods, Roman merchants moving south with grain and manufactured goods and the accumulated luxuries of a Mediterranean civilization. The river, which had been a corridor of war, became again what it had always been for most of human history, a road, a lifeline, a source of connection between people whose cultures were radically different, but whose need for each other's goods was essentially the same. In Mero, the years after the treaty were years of building. Kushite architecture reached heights that would not be surpassed. Pyramids rose from the desert floor in clusters, smaller than the Egyptian pyramids, steeper, built with a distinctive Kushite sensibility that favored height over breadth, that pointed at the sky like exclamation marks carved in stone. By some modern counts, there are more ancient pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt, more monuments to Kushite royalty than to all the pharaohs of the Nile Valley combined. That is a fact that tends to surprise people who have never been told that Kush existed. The temples of Mero showed it culture in full creative flower. Kushite religion borrowed from Egypt. The god Amun was worshipped in both kingdoms, but transformed what it borrowed into something distinctly its own. The lion-headed war god Apedemak had no equivalent in Egypt or Greece or Rome. He was depicted in reliefs with multiple heads, multiple arms, a being of pure, ferocious Kushite identity. The artistic traditions of Kush had their own grammar, their own vocabulary of images, their own way of understanding what divinity looked like and what it meant to represent power in stone. And the Kandake continued to rule. After Amanirenas, the tradition of female sovereigns in Kush did not diminish, it deepened. Subsequent Kandakes appear in the archaeological and written record with the same authority, the same iconographic power, the same position at the center of the kingdom's political and military life. One of them, Amanirenas, who ruled roughly a generation after Amanirenas, appears in so many temple inscriptions and construction records that some scholars believe she may have been one of the most prolific builders in the entire history of Kush. Her name is carved into temples from Meroe to Naka, supervising the construction of monuments that still stand in the Sudanese desert 2,000 years later. The Kandake tradition would eventually find its way into an unexpected text. In the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, there is a brief story about a man described as a court official of the Kandake of Kush, an Ethiopian eunuch. The text calls him traveling home from Jerusalem, reading the scriptures on his chariot, and encountering the apostle Philip on the road. The story is a minor episode in the larger narrative of the early church, but its casual mention of the Kandake, not explained, not introduced as though it requires explanation, suggests that by the 1st century of the Common Era, the Kandakes of Kush were well known enough throughout the ancient world that a writer addressing an audience across the Mediterranean could simply name the institution and expect to be understood. This is the irony of Amanirenas' erasure from Roman historical memory. She was erased from Roman accounts, but she was not erased from the world's memory. Her kingdom continued, her successors continued. The institution she embodied, the Kandake, the sovereign queen of Kush, continued to be real enough, visible enough, historically present enough that it appeared in the foundational texts of a religion that would eventually reshape the entire civilization that had tried to erase her. But the Roman erasure was real, and it was deliberate. Strabo, the Greek geographer who wrote about the war with Kush in the generation after it happened, mentioned a Candace in a single sentence. He described her as a masculine sort of woman, bold and missing an eye. He gave her no name. He gave her almost no context. He moved on quickly, as though the entire episode was a minor footnote in the larger story of Roman Egypt. Pliny the Elder mentioned the Kushite raids in a paragraph. Cassius Dio, writing centuries after the fact, gave a brief summary of the conflict, with no sense that it represented anything significant about the limits of Roman power. Empires are not good at remembering the wars they did not win. Rome had a vast literary tradition, histories, biographies, official records, the collected observations of men who believed their civilization was the apex of human achievement and who wrote accordingly. But that tradition had no template for a story in which a southern queen forced Augustus Caesar to renegotiate his borders. There was no triumphant march. There was no defeated enemy in chains. There was no monument in Rome marking the victory, because there was no victory. There was a treaty, a quiet, pragmatic, undeniable acknowledgement that the world had edges, and that one of those edges was a woman with one eye who had decided that this particular empire would not cross her threshold. So the story went underground, like the bronze head beneath the temple steps, present, waiting, patient as the desert itself. It would wait nearly 2,000 years. In 1910, a British archaeologist named John Garstang was working through the sand at Meroe with the methodical patience that serious excavation demands. The site had been known to European scholars for decades. The pyramids were visible from a considerable distance, clusters of steep stone triangles rising from the desert floor, clearly royal, clearly ancient, clearly the remnants of something that had once been magnificent. But Meroe was remote. The Sudanese desert did not accommodate casual visitors. Resources were limited. The work went slowly, season by season, trench by trench, the ground giving up its secrets in the grudging way the ground always does when it has been keeping them for 2,000 years. Garstang's team excavated pyramids. They catalogued pottery. They copied inscriptions in Meroitic script onto paper with careful hands, preserving symbols they could not yet read, trusting that someone, someday, would find the key. They documented the scale of the iron slag heaps, those enormous mounds of waste from centuries of smelting that told a story of industrial production no one in Europe had expected to find this far south. They were building a picture, fragment by fragment, of a civilization that the history books had told them barely existed. And then, beneath the threshold of a temple, they found the face, a bronze head, Roman in its craftsmanship, unmistakably, immediately, startlingly Roman. The idealized features, the calm expression of a man who expected the world to organize itself around his wishes, the technical mastery of an artisan working at the height of Mediterranean civilization. It was the portrait of Augustus Caesar, Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, and it had been lying face up in the earth beneath a temple doorway in the capital of Kush for somewhere close to 2,000 years. The condition was extraordinary. The bronze had aged, turned the deep green of old metal left to the mercy of time, but the face was intact. Every feature preserved, the eyes still looking upward at the underside of the threshold stone, the expression still composed, still serene, still radiating the kind of authority that had been carefully manufactured by some of the finest sculptors Rome could employ. But the authority had ended at the threshold, on the other side of that doorway, in the temple beyond. The gods of Kush had been worshipped for generations by people who walked across the face of Rome's emperor without knowing it and without caring. The most deliberate act of symbolic contempt in the ancient world had worked exactly as Amanirenas intended, silently, permanently, for 20 centuries. Garstang recognized immediately that he had found something extraordinary. The head was carefully removed, documented, transported north, and eventually made its way to the British Museum in London, where it remains today. It sits in a glass case, Visitors pass it constantly, school children on field trips, tourists working through the ancient world galleries with their audio guides, scholars who stop and look for longer than most. The label beside it is brief. Bronze head of Augustus from Meroe, Sudan. A date. A catalogue number. A few sentences of context. Most people who look at it have no idea what they're actually looking at. They see a beautiful Roman artifact in an unexpected location and move on. They do not see the column of Kushite warriors crossing the desert with bronze carts. They do not see the deliberate placement, the face turned upward, the threshold laid over it like a final judgment. They do not see Amanirenas. They do not see what the head represents. Not Roman power, but the precise geographic and moral limit of Roman power, marked in bronze and buried in the earth of a kingdom that refused to become a province. The head is a monument, not to Augustus, to her. The full story of what Garstang found at Meroe took decades to assemble. Throughout the 20th century, archaeologists working in Sudan built a picture of Kushite civilization that demolished piece by piece the assumptions that had allowed it to be ignored for so long. Gold jewelry of breathtaking intricacy emerged from royal tombs, filigree work, inlaid stones, craftsmanship that required skills developed over generations and refined to a level that rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Iron weapons and tools confirmed the scale of the smelting industry. Temple reliefs showed the Kandakes in full royal iconography, weapons raised, enemies subdued, crowns balanced on heads that looked directly at the viewer, with the calm confidence of people who expected to be taken seriously. The Meroitic script remained the great puzzle. Scholars in the early 20th century managed to decode the phonetic values of most of the characters, a significant achievement that meant they could sound out words, recognize names, follow the rough outline of royal genealogies. But the language itself, the grammar and vocabulary that would unlock the full meaning of the texts, remained stubbornly opaque. There was no Rosetta Stone for Meroitic, no bilingual inscription that would provide a bridge from the known to the unknown. The Kushites had developed a writing system entirely their own, unrelated to Egyptian hieroglyphs, unrelated to any other known script, and they had used it to record a civilization whose interior life we can still only partially access. That silence is itself a kind of testimony. It tells you the Kush was not a tributary of Egypt, not a footnote to the Nile Valley civilization that Mediterranean scholars found easier to understand because the Greeks had written about it extensively. Kush was its own thing. It borrowed from Egypt. Religious iconography, certain architectural forms, the broad outlines of royal ceremonial, the way that any sophisticated culture borrows from its neighbors, taking what is useful and transforming it into something new. But Kushite pyramids are not Egyptian pyramids. They are steeper, more pointed, built with a different internal structure, expressing a different aesthetic sensibility about what it means to reach toward the sky. Kushite temples combined Egyptian elements with indigenous traditions in ways that produced something you could not find anywhere else in the ancient world. Kushite burial goods reflected a culture with its own ideas about what the dead needed and what the living owed them. This was a civilization, a complete, sophisticated, self-sufficient civilization. And it had been buried, not just literally beneath the desert sand, but intellectually, historiographically, in the assumptions of European scholarship that spent centuries looking at Africa and finding it difficult to see what was actually there. The reasons for that blindness were not innocent. When European scholars began reconstructing the ancient world in earnest during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they worked from a template that placed Greece and Rome at the center of everything that mattered. The classical civilizations were legible, their languages could be learned, their texts could be read, their philosophical and artistic traditions resonated with European intellectual values in ways that felt like recognition. The study of antiquity became, in practice, the study of the Mediterranean world and of the texts that Mediterranean writers had left behind. Africa appeared in those texts mostly as a periphery, a source of grain, of exotic animals, of slaves, of distant rumors. Its own civilizations, its own written traditions, its own long histories of governance and culture and military power appeared only when they intersected with Mediterranean concerns. And when they did appear, they were minimized. The Kushite war with Rome was, by any reasonable measure, a significant event. A major empire had invaded a southern kingdom, sacked one of its ancient capitals, and then been forced by sustained guerrilla resistance to negotiate a treaty that gave it essentially nothing. That is a story with genuine historical weight. But because the story made Rome look limited, because it complicated the narrative of Roman invincibility that European scholars had inherited and in many cases personally identified with, it was passed over, mentioned in footnotes, compressed into single sentences, allowed to remain in the margins where it would not trouble the larger narrative. The racist dimensions of this erasure were explicit in some cases and implicit in others. The idea that Africa south of Egypt had no meaningful history, no cities, no states, no written traditions, no contributions to the human story worth recording, was not a conclusion that scholars reached through careful examination of the evidence. It was an assumption they brought to the evidence, and then used the evidence to confirm by ignoring everything that contradicted it. Kush did not fit the story, so Kush was not told. It was not until the latter half of the 20th century as archaeologists excavated Meroe and Napata and the pyramid fields of Sudan with genuine rigor, as post-colonial scholarship began to interrogate the assumptions baked into European historiography, as African and Sudanese scholars began contributing their own perspectives to the reconstruction of their own past, that the full shape of what had been lost started to become visible. And even now, with everything that has been uncovered, we are working with fragments. The Meroitic texts we cannot fully read may contain precisely the interior perspective we are missing, the Kushite account of the war with Rome, the Kushite understanding of Amanirenas' reign, the things she thought and said and decided that the Roman sources had no interest in recording. We may never know, or the key may still be waiting in the ground somewhere, patient as the bronze head was patient, holding its secrets until the right person with the right tools arrives at the right moment. What we know is enough to understand the shape of what was lost and the shape of what endured. Amanirenas disappears from the historical records sometime after the Treaty of 21 before the Common Era. We do not know when she died. We do not know where she is buried, though her pyramid may be among the many in the fields at Meroe that have not yet been fully excavated or identified. We do not have her words. We do not have her account of the war. We do not have the Kushite version of the morning at Syene, of the march through the desert with the bronze carts, of the negotiation at Samos, of the moment when the treaty was confirmed and the Roman forces began their withdrawal, and the Dodecashoinos returned to Kushite hands. We have the bronze head, we have the pyramids, we have the temple reliefs showing Kandake in full royal authority, we have the iron slag heaps and the gold jewelry and the partially decoded script. We have the 3 centuries of independence that followed the treaty, 300 years during which Kush traded and built and governed itself without Roman interference, during which the Kandake tradition continued, during which Meroe remained a living city at the center of a living kingdom. 300 years. Let that settle for a moment. From the Treaty of 21 before the Common Era to the decline of the Kushite kingdom in the 4th century of the Common Era, Kush endured as an independent power. Rome built the Colosseum during that period. Christianity spread across the Mediterranean. Emperors rose and fell. The city of Rome itself was eventually sacked. Entire civilizations transformed beyond recognition, and through all of it the kingdom that Amanirenas had defended continued. Its pyramids continued rising. Its merchants continued moving along the Nile. Its queens continued ruling. That is not a footnote. That is a legacy. The bronze head of Augustus still sits in its glass case in London, green with age, silent, staring upward with the same expression it wore when Roman craftsmen finished it, all those centuries ago, intending it to project the permanence of imperial authority to the people of the southern Nile. It projected something else entirely. It projected the precise location where that authority stopped. It projected the intelligence and determination of a woman who understood that the most powerful statement she could make was not a declaration of war, but the quiet, permanent, physical fact of a threshold. You walk over this face to enter our temple. You do not walk through our door. Empires leave monuments. They carve their names into stone. They build arches to commemorate their triumphs and columns to list their victories, and they expect those monuments to tell the story of history for as long as stone endures. But stone is not always the most honest narrator. Sometimes the most honest thing in the archive is what was buried, what was hidden, not to be forgotten, but to make a point that would last longer than the empire that inspired it. Augustus Caesar is remembered as one of the most consequential figures in human history. His name became a title. Every Roman emperor after him was called Augustus. The month of August is named for him. His reforms shaped the structure of Western civilization for centuries. He is in the history books, in the museums, in the popular imagination, in the films and novels and television dramas about the ancient world. He is not forgotten, but the woman who buried his face in the earth of her kingdom, who looked at the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever assembled and decided that it would not cross her border, who fought a war of exhaustion with such precision and patience that Rome eventually decided peace was cheaper than conquest, who secured 300 years of independence for her people through a combination of military genius, strategic clarity, and an absolute refusal to accept the terms the empire wanted to impose. That woman was erased, minimized, compressed into a single sentence in a geography textbook, mentioned as a curiosity, described as masculine and one-eyed, as though her physical appearance were more notable than what she had accomplished. History tried to bury her the way she buried Augustus, but it did not account for the archaeologists. It did not account for the moment in 1910 when a man brushed sand from a bronze face beneath a temple threshold and held 2,000 years of silence in his hands. It did not account for the scholars who spent careers learning to read Meroitic script, who catalogued tomb goods and temple reliefs and iron slag heaps, who built, fragment by patient fragment, the picture of a civilization that had refused to disappear even when history refused to record it. It did not account for the simple, stubborn fact that the pyramids of Sudan are still standing, that the temples of Meroe are still there, that the evidence of what Kush was and what it achieved was never fully gone, only covered, only waiting. Amanirenas did not need Rome to remember her. Her kingdom remembered her. The institution she embodied, the Kandake, the sovereign queen who commanded armies and negotiated treaties and walked onto temple walls in the full iconography of royal power, continued for generations after her death. Her legacy was not a monument with her name carved on it. Her legacy was 300 years of a people governing themselves, building their own temples, burying their own queens in their own pyramids, trading on their own terms, living in the specific, irreplaceable freedom of a kingdom that had looked empire in the face and said no. That is what the buried bronze head means. Not that Rome was weak. Rome was not weak. Rome was the most formidable military and administrative power the ancient world had produced. What the buried head means is that strength is not the same as inevitability. That empire has edges, that some people, in some places, in some moments of history, find within themselves the clarity and the courage and the strategic intelligence to hold their ground against forces that should, by every calculation, be unstoppable. And when they do, when one person or one people or one kingdom refuses to accept the terms that power is trying to impose, something remarkable happens. The calculation changes, the empire blinks, the legions turn around, the border is redrawn, and for 300 years, in the desert south of the first cataract of the Nile, a kingdom lives free. Amanirenas never conquered Rome. She never needed to. She only needed to make it cost more than it was worth. And in doing so, she achieved something that no military triumph could have given her. Not just independence, but proof, permanent, undeniable, bronze proof that was buried in the earth and preserved through 20 centuries, and lifted into the light by careful hands, and placed in a museum where you can go and look at it today. You can stand in front of that green bronze face in London and know what you are actually looking at. Not the power of Augustus Caesar, the limit of it, the exact geographic and moral boundary where the greatest empire on earth stopped, turned around, and went home, because a one-eyed queen from the edge of the known world had done the mathematics first. And the answer she came up with was the same answer that every empire eventually confronts, whether it is ready to or not. Some people will never stop fighting for what is theirs, and in the end, that is always enough.